Good evening. Welcome to awakentheworld.ca. My name is Garen, and this evening we're going to be talking about history. And what is history? I mean, I have a saying that I always say to people when they start talking about history, and that is, if you wish to know just the tiniest piece of truth about an event in history, you're going to have to read 10 books from 10 different authors from both sides of the argument, whatever the event was, okay? The opposing parties. And then if you read all of those, there's a small chance that you're going to get a piece of the truth, but you're certainly not going to get all the truth. What is history? History is exactly that, his story. It's a point of view. Far too often we see, and again, this, I hate to use the example that religion provides so readily, but you see this in religions, for example, and it's used over and over and over again. Uh, there's things in the history that we know that support my point of view. So I'm going to point those out and I'm going to say, because there are these theories about our history that agree with me, I'm right. This is the way it is. And of course, you have found things in history that agree with your point of view. And you're coming to me to point out that the things you have found, the theories that you have found, point to you being right. And when we start dragging all that stuff into the present moment, we typically end up at war with each other over it. It's really quite sad and comical both at the same time. Um, what happens in the school system, and this is where we really let our future down, okay, is the same as with a number of other subjects, history especially though, we don't so much teach our children as we indoctrinate them. I mean, Canada Day, Columbus Day, the list, Thanksgiving Day, the list goes on and on. If you look at the actual history behind those days, you look at what they actually represent, more times than not, they're simply not worthy of a celebration at all. As a matter of fact, we should probably be hanging our heads in shame and saying, man, have we messed this up for all these years? We got to make this right. Columbus, for example, the guy was a mass murderer. And that's the barest of the mountain of things that he perpetrated on tribes on his journeys and what he was known. It just, like, do the research. There's nothing to be celebrating. Same as Canada Day. I mean, Canada Day, Canada was known by that word for hundreds of years prior to the day that the Brits decided now was the day we were going to have Canada. And there's, of course, a long history with the First Nations here, the same as there are in the States, of course, with the broken treaties and the lies and the promises of the white man that keep getting broken over and over and over again. Now, of course, the bottom line is that we can argue about who's right and who's wrong when it comes to history until we're blue in the face, until we go to war and kill each other over it. Or at the very least, hate each other and never talk to each other again. And that doesn't make a lot of sense because neither one of us are actually right. The things that I have found in history that support my point of view, that is in wrong thinking. Logically, it just doesn't make sense. And you have to look at it a little different to figure it out. Understanding that history is always a point of view and that history is fluid. I mean, when I was young, dinosaurs were all covered in scales. The Tyrannosaurus Rex was the meanest thing on the planet, and it could grapple you with its front claws and hold you while it chomped on you with its teeth. And all these years later, half of those dinosaurs now have feathers. Tyrannosaurus Rex, his little tiny feet were really not worth of anything at all up front. And I mean, everything changes. Everything changes. The earth herself has swallowed up all traces of more civilizations than we will ever know. You know, through large geologic events, many of those civilizations were simply wiped clean from the planet. There will never be a trace found. It's been turned back into molten material and circulated through the Earth's crust. Uh, a case in point, although we're going to find the evidence here because we're seeing it, a new laser mapping technique done aerially, interesting word, has shown over 10,000 new dwellings and temples and defense areas and agricultural areas in Guatemala. And they figured that the Mayan civilization there is what was at least 10 million people, which puts the original number that they've been, talking about historically now as a couple of million to shame. There is no set history. Our history is actually a monument. If you didn't see the video on why physical reality is a monument, I really do invite you to see it. You can find it posted on many of our group pages as well as the Awaken the World page, or our YouTube channel, or the website. Um, if we look at evolution from a spiritual point of view, okay, everything that we see manifest here first begins in the spiritual realm. That's where it all begins. It always has to. The creative sea of consciousness. By the time it goes through the matrix of thought and then into word and deed, well, the ultimate result is that energy becomes more and more dense as it passes through, and wabam, we've created something. And what we've created is a monument because, of course, it's actually the past thoughts, words, and deeds that allowed it to be visible now. If you wouldn't have had the thoughts, words, and deeds first, there'd be no monument in front of you, i.e. you're making a sculpture. If you don't think about what you're doing, if you don't at least talk to yourself about what you're doing, and if you don't actually get to the work of making the piece of art, you're never going to get there. And once you do get there, it's instantly a monument. So, believe it or not, that actually applies to us. Because as far as evolution goes, and this is evolution from both the spiritual and a relative world point of view, okay, the relative universe, the intent at our higher self level manifested through our vehicle, okay, the temple, which triggers minute changes within the temple, our thoughts, which also trigger changes within the temple, right down to a genetic level, our words, and then finally our deeds. And this is the process of our evolution. This is our real history. Because we will never be able to say for any certainty. I mean, we may get to the point where we can say, okay, well, 20% of our past is certain. But we will never get to the point where we know so much as even 50% of our past. And history has a tendency to always be written by the victors. Never ever forget, it's just a point of view. When it comes to evolution from a spiritual sense, historically, our history is amazing. It's beautiful. I coined the term just yesterday. Somebody was talking about peace, and it just came into my head from my higher self like a bolt of lightning. People everywhere acknowledging common existence. And that really applies to our history and our evolution as well, okay? Our evolution from a spiritual point of view, from that higher point of view, when I look at it, it's beautiful. That initial eddy of conscious awareness that grew and in the physical universe manifested as dust and rock collecting, gases collecting, and the eventual formation of our earth, and then life springing up upon it. All of that conscious evolution is all us. That is our heritage. It's our common heritage. That is the history of humanity. All the monuments, all the physical things, they're merely just detail. I mean, they're great to look at, and they're a lot of fun, and there's a lot to be learned. But at the same time, never mistake that they're exactly that, history, the past. We don't need to drag or fight or argue about the past in the present moment in any shape or form. It's history. And this same rule can be applied to the arguments we've had in the past, for example. You know, we say we have history with someone. Well, what does that mean? It means, well, sometime in the past, so, okay, both people now are totally different, but in the past, there was an issue. To continually bring the issue from the history, your story about it, into your present moment over and over and over again is the same sort of insanity that says, well, we've owned this place since the dawn of time and you have no right to be here. You know, that same sort of history that's twisted to our benefit, to serve. You know, some of our history is quite obvious, okay? But a lot of it's not. I mean, you know, Orville and Wilbur Wright, given credit for the plane. Take a look at a couple of brothers in Germany 2 weeks prior to that. Okay, they didn't fly as far by a fair distance, but they still flew. Another good one to take an honest look at, if you're really interested to see how fictional our history is the events surrounding the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The evidence is quite clear that Roosevelt backed Japan into a corner from which they saw no escape. There's so many things that we just don't know, that we blindly accept. And the danger in getting too caught up in history is when history is twisted by the victor, and it's being twisted all the time. Because history is fluid. It's never static. If it was, we wouldn't have to keep replacing textbooks year after year after year. But don't get caught up in the physical history as being manifest of truth, because it's not. It's manifest of a point of view. And you have your own, and you're entitled to it. This has been Garen for awakentheworld.ca. Namaste to you, and we wish peace upon you, and that you come to have that awakening experience that connects you with the one that we all are, and we can move our whole world forward in that. Good night.